It was an ordinary summer morning in the quiet English town of Church Crookham, until it wasn't. Inside a modest home, a mother opened the door to her son's bedroom, expecting to call him down for breakfast. Instead, she found him lying still, unresponsive. No blood, no struggle, just a terrible silence. Dan Brandon, 31 years old, was dead. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of an attack, except for one terrifying detail. His beloved pet, an 8-foot African rock python named Tiny, was missing from her enclosure. She wasn't in her tank, she was in the room. And Dan was no longer breathing. Was this a tragic accident? Or had the bond between man and beast crossed a line that could never be reversed? Welcome to the Animal Quest channel. If you care about real-life animal encounters and the mysteries they leave behind, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button. This is the story of Dan Brandon. Dan Brandon lived in Church Crookham, a quiet village in Hampshire, England, a place where you'd least expect a death that would shake the entire country. He was just 31 years old, a fitness trainer, full of energy and life. Dan was known for his big smile, muscular build, and even bigger heart. His friends described him as the kind of guy who made everyone laugh. But beneath his strength and charm was something else, something more unusual. Dan had a deep, almost spiritual connection to animals. Not just dogs or cats, but reptiles, birds of prey, tarantulas, and snakes. Lots of them. He kept over a dozen exotic animals in his room in a carefully managed environment, enclosures, heating systems, safety locks. But among all his pets, one stood out. Tiny. Tiny wasn't tiny at all. She was an African rock python, a powerful, unpredictable species that can grow up to 20 feet in the wild. But Dan had raised her since she was small enough to curl in the palm of his hand. He didn't see her as a threat, he saw her as family. Dan's mother, Barbara Brandon, later told the Inquest that Dan had formed a rare bond with the snake. He never showed fear. In fact, she said, Dan loved all of his animals, but Tiny, he had a special connection with her. She was his favorite. Every day, Dan would handle her with ease, coiling her gently around his shoulders, letting her slide across his arms. He often shared photos and videos online, smiling with her wrapped around his body like a living necklace. To outsiders, it looked dangerous, but to Dan, it was trust. His close friend Chris once said, Dan never feared his animals. He respected them, especially Tiny. She was different. It was like he understood her. But in the weeks before his death, something started to change. Tiny had become more unpredictable, restless, aggressive, even uncharacteristically jumpy. Dan noticed it. So did his mother. He reportedly moved Tiny out of her usual handling rotation. He stopped putting her around his neck. Something about her behavior had unsettled him, yet he didn't want to let her go. He loved her too much. Still, the question hangs heavy over everything. Why keep such a powerful creature so close when the warnings were right in front of him? Was it trust? Was it denial? Or was it the belief that love could override nature? Whatever the answer, it would all come to a head on that quiet summer morning in August 2017. And by then, it was already too late. Tiny wasn't small, not by any stretch of the imagination. She was an African rock python, and at the time of Dan Brandon's death, she measured over 8 feet in length, with the girth and muscle density to overpower anything her size or larger. She had outgrown her enclosure long ago, and yet Dan often let her roam freely, in his room, across his furniture, even near his bed. This wasn't some misunderstood garden snake. African rock pythons are among the largest and most powerful snakes in the world. Native to sub-Saharan Africa, they don't rely on venom to subdue prey. Instead, they wait in silence, coiling, watching, calculating. Then when the moment is right, they strike, wrapping their thick, muscular bodies around their target in bone-crushing silence, squeezing tighter with each breath the victim tries to take, until breathing stops entirely. In the wild, they're known to take down antelope, crocodiles, even leopards. To a creature like that, a 13-stone man like Dan Brandon wouldn't be impossible. But here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Dan didn't fear that, not once. In fact, he trusted Tiny more than most people trust their dogs. According to statements made at the inquest, Dan often slept with his bedroom door closed, with Tiny loose in the room. Sometimes she was curled up in the corner. Other nights, she might have been under the bed, behind a dresser, or simply draped across something warm. Dan believed she would never harm him. He believed in their bond. But snakes, unlike dogs, don't show affection. They don't wag their tails or lick your hand. Their calm behavior is simply patience, stillness, observation, and sometimes unpredictability. Dan wasn't oblivious to risk. In fact, his mother, Barbara Brandon, told the hearing that he had recently stopped putting Tiny around his neck. He'd grown uneasy about her size and her strength, but even then, he never locked her away. He couldn't. That bond, that strange loyalty, it ran deep, and that raises a difficult, haunting question. Did he love her too much to recognize the danger she posed? Now, here's something most people don't know. Owning a snake like Tiny in the United Kingdom is legal. Under the Dangerous Wild Animals Act 1976, individuals can keep exotic and potentially deadly animals if they obtain the proper license and follow safety regulations. But in practice, enforcement is thin. Local authorities handle licensing, and unless a complaint is made or something goes tragically wrong, no one checks. Dan Brandon's case revealed just how easy it is to keep powerful exotic animals behind closed doors, with no real oversight, no red flags, no inspections, no warnings, just one man, one snake, in a silence no one heard, until it was far too late. It was the early hours of August 25, 2017, in Church Crookham, Hampshire. The sun had barely crept over the rooftops when Barbara Brandon, Dan's mother, began her usual morning routine. She moved quietly through the home they shared, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of her son, footsteps upstairs, music playing, the hum of heat lamps from his collection of exotic pets. But this morning, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just stillness. Barbara called out to him once, then again, louder. Still no answer. Something wasn't right. She climbed the stairs and walked to the bedroom door. It was shut. That wasn't unusual. Dan often kept it closed to control the heat and humidity for his reptiles. But behind that door was silence. She knocked, waited, still nothing. With a growing sense of dread, she opened the door, and what she saw changed her life forever. Dan was lying motionless on the floor near his bed. His body was still warm, but lifeless. He wasn't breathing. His skin had already begun to pale. His arms were curled awkwardly beneath him, his eyes open, and nearby, slithering slowly across the floor, was Tiny. The enormous African rock python, usually kept secured in a custom-built enclosure, was out, completely free, not hiding, not coiled up, just there. At first, Barbara couldn't process what she was looking at. There were no bite marks, no wounds, no signs of struggle. Dan looked untouched, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The paramedics arrived quickly, and by then, there was no saving him. What they found during examination chilled them all. Dan had suffered a catastrophic rupture of blood vessels in his eyes and extensive internal bruising around the neck and chest. These were not the signs of a fall or medical event. They were textbook indicators of asphyxiation, being squeezed to death. But by what? There was only one answer. Tiny, the snake Dan had raised, the snake he trusted, the snake he had let sleep in the very same room. The official inquest, led by coroner Andrew Bradley, ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation. The evidence was clear. According to Bradley's exact words, the most likely scenario is that the snake coiled around Dan, possibly in a show of affection or stress. Not an attack, not a feeding response, but an accident from something too powerful to control. Barbara told the hearing she believed Dan had been handling Tiny in his room when the fatal incident occurred. She said he may have slipped or fallen, or perhaps in a moment of trust he let her coil too far. But by the time she realized what had happened, it was already over. The most chilling part, there were no sounds of struggle, no calls for help, no broken furniture, just one man, one snake, and a silence that descended so quickly no one heard a thing. Tiny hadn't left the room. She hadn't escaped. She had stayed, close to him. Whether that was affection, confusion, or instinct, we may never truly know. But what we do know is this. On that quiet summer morning in Hampshire, a man died alone in his bedroom, surrounded by the very creatures he loved most, and the one he trusted the most may have taken his last breath. In the days that followed Dan Brandon's death, the quiet village of Church Crookham buzzed with a question that no one could answer. How could this happen? He was young, fit, smart. He loved animals and knew how to handle them. And yet, he was dead, alone in his bedroom, with no signs of a struggle and only one possible culprit. An official inquest was launched by the Northeast Hampshire coroner's office, overseen by Andrew Bradley. It was a rare case, one that had never before occurred in the United Kingdom. A man allegedly killed by his own snake. Over the next few months, statements were taken, evidence examined, and expert testimonies reviewed. And slowly, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Dan hadn't been reckless, but he had been comfortable, too comfortable. Witnesses described how Dan allowed Tiny, the 8-foot African rock python, to move freely around his room. No barriers, no separation. He believed they had a bond, one that didn't require fear or boundaries. But that belief may have cost him his life. According to testimony from Dan's mother, Barbara Brandon, Tiny had started acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the incident. She had grown more aggressive, striking unpredictably, showing signs of stress, even hissing at movement. Dan himself had begun to limit how he handled her, avoiding placing her around his neck. Still, he didn't isolate her. He didn't lock her away. He was trying to respect her space, while clinging to a trust that perhaps no longer existed. The coroner reviewed all the medical evidence. There were no puncture wounds, no signs of venom, but what they did find was conclusive. Bruising across Dan's neck and chest, bleeding in the eyes, and the kind of internal trauma only caused by sustained, crushing force. Not by accident, not by chance, by constriction. Andrew Bradley's final ruling was as haunting as it was rare. Dan Brandon died as a result of asphyxiation. The snake, Tiny, was instrumental in his death. It was a case that defied logic. There was no intent, no motive, just raw physical instinct meeting human trust in the wrong moment. One quote from the courtroom echoed through national headlines and left a chill in its wake. She may have done it by accident. She may have seen him as a tree to climb, but what happened was fatal. And that's what made this case so deeply unsettling. This wasn't a violent attack. There was no warning, no aggression, no sound. Just one miscalculated movement from a powerful creature. And it was over. In the eyes of the law, there was no crime, no foul play. But in the hearts of everyone who heard the story, there was one lingering question. How close is too close? When the animal you love is strong enough to kill you without even meaning to? And for Dan Brandon, the answer came far too late. In the weeks following the inquest, a new wave of questions emerged, ones that couldn't be answered in a courtroom. Could a pet snake really kill a human? Was Dan Brandon's death a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy, or a warning sign we've ignored for far too long? To find out, the investigation turned to experts, herpetologists, exotic animal handlers, behavioral biologists, the few people who truly understand what a massive constrictor like Tiny is capable of. And their answers were chilling. One leading reptile expert, when asked if a python could kill its owner without intending to, replied bluntly, "Snakes don't see humans as prey, but they do see us as objects, warmth, movement, trees to climb. If a large python coils around a person, even playfully, and tightens, it doesn't take long before it turns deadly, not out of aggression, but instinct." Let that sink in. To a snake, you are not a person. You are an environment, an object to navigate. And when they constrict, they don't understand your limits. They don't stop because they don't know how. Dan Brandon's case quickly became the first officially recorded incident in the UK where a python was considered responsible for its owner's death. There were rumors and whispers in the past, cases that lacked evidence or were ruled inconclusive. But Dan's wasn't like those. This was different. There was a body, a cause of death, and a known suspect. And while experts were careful to say it was an accident, many of them agreed. The warning signs were all there. Tiny had grown large, too large. Her behavior had changed. Her enclosure was no longer enough. She was no longer a manageable pet. She was a wild animal in a domestic setting. So that led to an even bigger question, one that made headlines across the UK. Should private citizens be allowed to keep large constrictor snakes at all? Because while Dan's death was the first, experts feared it wouldn't be the last. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act, passed in the UK in 1976, allows ownership of exotic pets like African rock pythons, but the system relies heavily on self-reporting, local licensing, and minimal inspections. In most cases, no one checks in unless something goes horribly wrong. And now, it had. One behavioral scientist stated, "People build bonds with animals, but we forget. Wild instincts don't disappear just because we feed them or love them. The moment you let down your guard, nature reminds you who's in control." And that's the terrifying truth in Dan Brandon's case. He didn't die because Tiny hated him. He died because she didn't know what she was doing. And that in many ways is even more disturbing. After the headlines faded and the inquest closed, what remained was something no investigation could resolve: grief. In the heart of Church Crookham, the Brandon family tried to piece together a life forever changed. Barbara Brandon, Dan's mother, had not only lost her son, but had found him. She was the first person to walk into that room, the first to realize something was terribly wrong, and the only one who truly knew just how deep his love for his animals ran. She never blamed Tiny. Despite everything, despite the cause of death, the medical report, the expert analysis, Barbara stood firm in her belief. Dan loved that snake. I don't believe she meant to hurt him, but something went terribly wrong. She didn't see a monster. She saw a mistake, a tragic miscalculation born not of malice, but of trust gone too far. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. At Dan's memorial, friends gathered in silence. Candles were lit, letters were read aloud. A slideshow of memories flickered across the walls. Dan holding birds of prey on his arm, crouching beside a tarantula, laughing with Tiny draped around his neck. People spoke not just of who he was, but how he made them feel. One childhood friend wrote online, "Dan was the most fearless person I knew. He didn't just keep animals. He connected with them. He found beauty where others saw danger." Another comment read, "He trusted them because he believed love was stronger than instinct. That's what made him special, and maybe what made this so tragic." But beneath the sorrow was a quiet warning. Even Barbara, who refused to condemn Tiny, acknowledged that Dan had let his guard down. She told the hearing he had been concerned about the snake's growing strength. He had recently stopped putting her around his neck. Something inside him had sensed a shift, but not enough to change everything. Not enough to imagine that this animal, who had never bitten, never lashed out, could be the one to take his last breath. The loss rippled far beyond his family. Dan's story became a cautionary tale across the UK and beyond. Forums lit up with debate, animal advocates, exotic pet owners, lawmakers. Some asked how such a thing could happen in a modern country with laws and oversight. Others simply asked, how do you mourn someone when their killer lives in the same room they did? And though no charges were ever filed and no crime ever proven, the pain was no less real. Because love doesn't protect you from instinct, and trust, no matter how deep, can sometimes cost everything. Dan Brandon's death did more than shatter a family. It cracked open a national debate, one that had long simmered in silence. Because this wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a wake-up call. the story of a healthy, experienced animal handler, killed not by a mistake of his own making, but by the blurred line between love and danger. Almost immediately, animal welfare groups and public safety advocates reignited a conversation that had been pushed to the margins for years. Should exotic pets like large constrictor snakes be kept in private homes at all? In the weeks after the inquest, members of parliament and animal rights organizations began questioning the effectiveness of the Dangerous Wild Animals Act 1976, a law meant to regulate exotic animal ownership, but one that had seen few updates in decades. Critics pointed to loopholes, lack of inspections, and the reliance on local councils to enforce complex rules. Dan's case, tragic and unprecedented, suddenly gave the issue a face, a name, a home, and a devastating outcome. But even as headlines faded, the hard questions remained. How much risk are we truly bringing into our neighborhoods, our bedrooms, our children's homes? How do we honor a man's passion without repeating his mistake? And how do we protect others when trust alone is never enough? Dan Brandon's story lives on, not as a footnote, but as a powerful, painful lesson about what happens when wild instinct and human affection collide. Dan Brandon's death didn't just leave a family in mourning. It left behind a mystery, a warning, and a question that still haunts anyone who hears it. Can true affection between a human and a wild animal ever truly overcome nature's instincts? Or is that bond always, inevitably, doomed to break? He wasn't reckless. He wasn't naive. He was careful, loving, devoted. But in the end, none of that mattered. One thing is certain. Tiny wasn't so tiny after all. If you found this story shocking, disturbing, or unforgettable, subscribe for more real-life animal encounters and survival stories. Like the video if it kept you on edge. Share it with someone who loves or fears wild creatures. And tell us in the comments below, should powerful exotic animals like this be kept in private homes? Or is that a risk we can no longer afford? Thanks for watching, and stay curious, but stay safe.